The night my jaw was broken, the house looked perfect. The long mahogany dining table gleamed under the chandelier, polished so bright I could see my reflection in the wood. Silverware lined up like soldiers' wine glasses already filled the roast still steaming at the center of the table. If anyone walked in from the outside, they would have thought they had stepped into a magazine photo shoot of a family dinner, the kind that makes neighbors whisper about how lucky we are. But behind those polished surfaces, behind the smiles my parents wore in public, there was rot, and that night the mask finally split wide open. My father Richard, a man everyone in town admired as a brilliant lawyer with a commanding voice, leaned across the table, eyes narrowing at me like a predator about to pounce. "You dare talk back to me in this house!" His voice cut the air sharper than any knife in the kitchen. I should have kept quiet. I knew better. But I was 28 years old, a grown woman, and my crime was nothing more than saying I wanted to make a decision for myself. I told him I had my own plans, that I wasn't a child anymore. That was enough. The chair screeched against the floor as he stood. The room seemed to shrink as he loomed over me. I barely had time to process before his fist collided with my face, a crack like dry wood splitting, echoing in my skull. Pain shot through me so violently, my vision blurred. My ears rang, and then the warm, metallic taste of blood filled my mouth. I touched my jaw and felt the sickening shift of bone. It was broken. I remember gasping, half in shock, half in disbelief, when I heard the sound that will haunt me forever. My mother Diane, sitting just 2 seats away in her silk blouse, laughed. Not nervous laughter, not the kind you force when you are scared. No, it was a sharp, mocking chuckle that rolled out of her chest with satisfaction. Her perfectly painted lips curled, and she said words that sliced me deeper than the blow itself. Now you'll learn to keep that gutter mouth shut. The humiliation burned hotter than the pain. My father towered over me, his fists still clenched, veins bulging in his temples. My mother smirked, sipping her wine as though nothing was wrong. And me, sitting there with blood dripping down my chin, realized they had finally gone too far. They thought they had silenced me, reduced me to nothing but a beaten child who would never rise again. But as the room spun and my head throbbed, something inside me shifted. Beneath the pain, beneath the terror, a smile flickered inside my soul, invisible to them. Because in that moment I understood something they didn't. They thought they broke me. They thought they owned me. But this was the night I stopped being their victim. This was the night I decided they would pay. On the outside, we were flawless. People in our neighborhood used to stop me on the street and say, "You must be so proud of your parents." They saw the glossy Christmas cards my mother mailed every December, the ones with all of us dressed in coordinated outfits, smiling like a Norman Rockwell painting. They saw my father shaking hands at charity events, his polished speeches about justice and integrity. They saw my mother in silk dresses raising glasses at fundraisers, complimenting everyone as if kindness was stitched into her very bones. They didn't see what I saw when the doors shut and the curtains closed. My father Richard built his reputation as one of the most respected attorneys in the county. He won cases with ruthless precision, never hesitating to twist the knife when he found weakness. People admired him for being sharp, disciplined, unstoppable. Inside the house, that same sharpness turned into fists, into words that cut deeper than steel, into rules so suffocating I often felt like I was choking. My mother Diane knew how to play her role. To the world, she was radiant, gracious, an event planner with a gift for perfection. Every dinner party she hosted shimmered with polished silver and endless wine. She laughed in all the right places, touched arms, gently remembered every name. At home, her laugh was different. At home, it came when my father raised his hand, when I was made to cry, when my spirit faltered. Her laugh was the soundtrack to my humiliation. As a child, I used to think maybe this was just what families were like. Maybe this was discipline. Maybe this was love in some twisted form. My father always said respect is earned by fear, not by softness, and my mother echoed him. He pushes you because he wants you to be strong. They trained me to believe pain was love. Silence was respect. Obedience was survival. I kept those beliefs locked in my chest for years, carrying them like stones. But there were moments, small cracks in the facade, when I realized not every family looked like mine. Sleepovers at friends' houses where fathers read bedtime stories instead of slamming doors. Mothers who hugged their children when they cried instead of smirking in the corner. Those glimpses made me ache, made me wonder why my home felt like a prison wrapped in velvet. To the outside world, we were enviable. Inside, I was drowning. And yet part of me still clung to the illusion because if I admitted the truth too soon that my family was toxic to its core, I would have to face the unbearable weight of being completely alone. When I think back to my childhood, the memories come in two colors. There are the bright, glittering fragments that look perfect enough to be framed my 10th birthday when my father rented a pony for the backyard, my mother in a sundress snapping pictures as the neighbors clapped. Our single beach vacation at Cape Cod where my father actually built a sandcastle with me, and for one brief afternoon laughed like a man without shadows. I held on to those shards like they were proof that maybe things weren't so bad, that maybe we were capable of love after all. But alongside them are the darker, heavier memories, the ones that weighed me down even when I was still too small to name what they were. I remember being forced to kneel on hardwood floors for hours because I left a cup on the counter. I remember my father's belt landing across my back after I brought home a grade that wasn't perfect. I remember my mother's eyes watching without flinching, and sometimes worse than that, I remember her smile. The contrast confused me. How could the same father who bought me cotton candy at the fair be the same man who slammed my head against the wall for laughing too loudly? How could the mother who braided my hair for picture day be the same woman who turned her face away when I cried out in pain? They trained me to call it discipline, to call it tough love, to call it anything but what it was. They told me, we're building you into someone strong. Weakness has no place in this world, and I believed them because I was a child and they were my parents. I thought all families had rules like ours, rules that felt like chains, yet even then I knew something was wrong. I felt it every time I visited a friend's house and saw her parents kiss her forehead, or when a teacher praised my writing and looked at me with genuine warmth, a look I never saw at home. I started keeping two versions of myself. The smiling, obedient daughter who said the right things at family dinners, who performed well enough at school to avoid punishment. And then there was the hidden me, the one who whispered into a pillow at night, the one who begged silently for an escape I couldn't yet imagine. Those early years carved deep cracks into me, but they also planted the seed of rebellion, small and fragile, waiting for the moment when I would finally let it grow. Adolescence should have been the time I tested boundaries, learned who I was, maybe even made mistakes and laughed them off. But in my house, being a teenager was like stepping into a minefield. Every step I took was measured, every breath monitored, every thought scrutinized. My father, Richard, believed control was the only way to raise a child, and my mother, Diane, believed silence was the only way to survive. Together, they built a cage around me and called it home. When I turned 15, I got my first cell phone, but it wasn't really mine. My father demanded it every night at 8 o'clock sharp. He scrolled through my texts with a lawyer's precision, searching for evidence of rebellion. If I deleted anything, he would compare it to the phone bill, and if numbers didn't match, the belt came out. I learned quickly that privacy was a luxury not allowed in our household. The first boy who liked me, Daniel, was kind. He walked me to class, carried my books, and wrote me notes on loose-leaf paper folded into shapes. For a fleeting moment, I felt like a normal girl, until the night Richard found one of those notes in my backpack. His face turned red, his voice thundered through the walls. "No man touches what's mine to protect," he roared. He called Daniel's parents, threatened legal action, and the next day Daniel avoided me in the hallways like I carried a disease. I cried in the bathroom stall until the bell rang, and when I got home, Diane simply said, "Better now than later." He wasn't worthy. Her words were knives disguised as comfort. There was the night I came home 10 minutes late from a school project. 10 minutes. Richard was waiting at the door, arms crossed. He dragged me outside and locked the door behind me. It was February snow biting at my skin. I sat on the porch, my teeth chattering, my fingers numb, until he finally opened the door an hour later. Diane handed me a blanket, but didn't meet my eyes. That was her way of surviving, never look too closely. School became my only refuge, but even there, his shadow followed me. He insisted on driving me to and from every activity, waiting in the car with the engine running. He reviewed my report cards with the scrutiny of a judge, and anything less than an A was grounds for punishment. "Excellence or nothing," he said, pounding his fist on the table. "Do you want to grow up weak? Do you want to be a failure?" I wanted to scream that perfection was impossible, that his rules were suffocating me, but the memory of the belt across my back kept my mouth shut. At family gatherings, relatives praised him. "Richard, you're such a dedicated father. Lydia is so well behaved." He smiled, soaking in the admiration. I wanted to tell them the truth, to shout that my obedience was carved out of fear, but my mother's sharp glance always silenced me. Later in the car, she would whisper, "Don't ruin this for us. He does what he does because he loves you." Gaslighting wrapped around me like barbed wire, cutting into me every time I tried to pull away. By the time I reached 17, I had become an expert at disappearing inside myself. I learned how to smile in photographs, how to sit quietly at dinner, how to speak in a voice soft enough not to provoke him. But inside, I was screaming. Every rule, every punishment, every humiliation etched anger deeper into my bones. I kept a small notebook hidden under my mattress, writing down everything he said, everything he did. It was the only way I could remind myself that I wasn't imagining it, that the abuse was real. I didn't know it then, but those notes would become my weapon one day. What terrified me most wasn't the belt or the cold nights on the porch. It was the thought that maybe they were right. Maybe I was weak. Maybe I was worthless without their control. That fear gnawed at me in the dark, but it also planted a spark. If I could prove them wrong, if I could escape, maybe I could finally breathe. If the punishments at home were the bruises no one saw, the public humiliations were the scars everyone did. My father thrived on appearances, and what better way to flex his control than by turning me into the perfect example of obedience in front of an audience? Family gatherings, dinner parties, even church functions all became stages where my humiliation was the showpiece. I remember one particular evening, a dinner party at our house with half a dozen of my father's colleagues. The table sparkled with crystal glasses, the smell of rosemary lamb filled the air, and my mother floated around refilling wine like a graceful hostess. I sat at the far end, silent, folding my hands neatly in my lap. I had practiced that posture. It was the safest way to survive. But silence wasn't enough. At one point, one of his colleagues asked politely about my plans after graduation. I opened my mouth carefully, rehearsed, ready to say, I hoped to attend university. Richard cut me off before I could finish. "Lydia!" He chuckled loudly, clapping me on the back so hard I nearly fell forward. "She'll still be under my roof at 30. That's how you raise discipline." The table erupted in laughter, some polite, some genuine, none of them knowing the truth behind the joke. My cheeks burned, my throat closed, and I stared down at my plate as if the mashed potatoes might swallow me whole. Across the table, my mother smirked into her wine glass. That wasn't the last time. At Thanksgiving, with relatives crowded into the living room, Richard raised a toast. "Here's to family, to tradition, to keeping our children in line." Then he gestured at me with his glass. "Lydia knows what happens if you step out of line, don't you?" He winked as if we shared some inside joke. I forced a smile, but my stomach twisted. No one at that table asked me if I was okay. No one pulled me aside. They laughed along because it was easier. Church potlucks were worse. Once, during a Sunday afternoon gathering, Richard announced loudly, "I don't need to worry about my daughter running off with some fool. She knows I'll break any boy's legs if he comes near her." People chuckled nervously, but he doubled down. "And she knows I mean it." He looked at me, daring me to contradict him. My lips stayed shut, but inside, I screamed. That day, I excused myself to the bathroom and cried until my eyes were red, then powdered my face and returned like nothing had happened. Public humiliation had a special sting. It wasn't just the pain of his words, it was the betrayal of everyone else's silence. Teachers, neighbors, relatives, they all heard him, saw me shrink, and did nothing. That silence carved something sharp inside me, a hatred for his power, a fury for her complicity, and a burning desire to one day expose them for what they really were. Even as the humiliations stacked up, I collected them. Each cruel joke, each smirk, each moment when my father's reputation was built on my pain, I stored them in the notebook under my mattress. Thanksgiving toast, discipline joke. Dinner party college plans mocked. Church threat about breaking boys' legs. I cataloged them like evidence because deep down I knew that one day I would need proof. By the time I was 20, I had learned to exist in two parallel worlds. In one, I was the obedient daughter, laughed at but silent the butt of every cruel joke. In the other, I was a quiet archivist recording every injustice, every humiliation, every scar. He thought his words would break me. What he didn't know was that every word was building my case against him. The breaking point came the year I turned 28. For years, I had lived in the shadow of Richard's control, surviving by keeping my head down, hiding my notebook of evidence, and imagining a future that felt impossible. Then an acceptance letter arrived in the mail, a letter that shimmered like a lifeline. I had been offered a partial scholarship to study journalism in New York City. The moment I held it in my hands, my heart pounded with something I hadn't felt in years: hope. I rehearsed the words for days, imagining how I might tell them, how maybe, just maybe, they would understand that I needed this, that it was my chance to build a life outside their walls. I chose a Sunday evening after dinner when the dishes were cleared and the candles burned low. I placed the letter carefully on the table, my fingers trembling. "I've been accepted," I said softly. "I want to take this opportunity. I want to move to New York." For a moment, silence hung heavy in the air. Diane sipped her wine, her eyes cold. Richard stared at me, his face unreadable. Then the storm broke. "Move!" he thundered, slamming his fist against the table so hard the glasses rattled. "Do you think you can survive without me? Do you think the world will protect you the way I have?" His voice rose venom in every syllable. "You are nothing without my name, my discipline, my rules." I tried to steady my voice. I am not a child anymore. I need to live my own life. That was the spark that lit the explosion. His chair screeched back, and in 2 strides he was looming over me. I stood, my chest heaving, but I didn't have time to move before his fist crashed into my face. The sound was unmistakable, bone shattering, a sickening crack that rang in my skull. Pain erupted white hot and blinding. I collapsed back into the chair, blood spilling down my chin. My jaw shifted grotesquely when I tried to breathe. It was broken. The room spun, my ears filled with the rush of blood. And then, cutting through it all, came the laugh. Diane's laugh. Sharp, cruel ringing with satisfaction. She leaned back in her chair, her pearls glinting in the candlelight, and with a smirk said, "Now you'll learn to keep that gutter mouth shut." Humiliation seared hotter than the pain. My mother's eyes gleamed as though she had been waiting years to see me crushed. My father stood above me, his fists still clenched, breathing heavily victorious. In that moment, something inside me shattered, but not in the way they thought. As I clutched my face, tasting blood and salt, I realized I was done. Done being their prisoner. Done swallowing the lies that this was love, done being silent. They believed they had silenced me forever. They couldn't see that behind my tears, behind my broken jaw, something else had ignited. A fire. I remember staring at them through blurred vision. Diane's smirk. Richard's towering frame, and feeling the shift inside me like the earth cracking open. I whispered to myself, barely audible, "This ends tonight." They didn't hear it. They thought I was broken beyond repair. They thought the story ended here, but what they didn't know was that this was only the beginning. That night, as I lay in my bed with a bag of ice pressed against my swollen face, I stared at the ceiling and felt the weight of 28 years pressing down on me. My jaw throbbed with every breath, sharp bolts of pain shooting through my skull. Talking was impossible, eating unbearable, but worse than the physical agony was the certainty that nothing would ever change if I stayed. For the first time, the truth crystallized: if I didn't get out, this house would kill me piece by piece until there was nothing left but silence. The next morning, Richard strutted out the door in his tailored suit as though nothing had happened. Diane moved through the kitchen humming, preparing coffee, her pearls still gleaming, her smile sharp and satisfied. I sat at the table, my jaw aching, trying to sip tea, and watched them with new eyes. They weren't protectors. They weren't family. They were predators who had feasted on my obedience for years, and I was done feeding them. I remembered the notebook hidden beneath my mattress pages filled with years of beatings, threats, humiliations, gaslighting. I remembered the photographs I had secretly taken on nights when bruises bloomed purple across my arms. I remembered the recordings I had started making capturing Richard's voice hurling curses, Diane's cold laughter. All of it was more than just memory now, it was evidence. That day, I slipped the notebook into my bag and walked to the library where computers weren't monitored by him. My hands trembled as I scanned the pages, emailing copies to myself, creating folders he could never touch. It felt like treason, but also like oxygen filling my lungs. I reached out to Maya, my oldest friend, the one person who had never stopped checking in on me even when I pushed her away out of fear. When she saw my face, her eyes filled with horror, but she didn't say, "Why didn't you leave sooner?" She just said, "It's time." And for the first time, I agreed. We sat together mapping out the beginning of a plan. She knew a lawyer willing to take on pro bono cases, someone unafraid of Richard's reputation. She promised me safe places to keep files, places he couldn't search. She reminded me that I wasn't weak, that surviving this long had taken strength he could never comprehend. That night, back in my room, I wrote in the notebook one last time. My hand shook, but my words were steady. This is not a diary anymore. This is a case file, and one day soon I will win. Once the decision was made, everything I did carried new purpose. For years, I had been documenting in secret, but now those scraps of evidence became the foundation of a strategy. Every bruise, every insult, every moment of control was no longer just pain, it was ammunition. I started with the notebook scanning every page and saving it into encrypted folders on cloud accounts Richard would never know existed. Maya sat beside me at the library computer, helping me organize everything by date 2008. Locked outside in winter 2012. Boyfriend threatened 20. Dinner party humiliation. Seeing the years of abuse stacked chronologically was both horrifying and strangely empowering. It was undeniable. Next were the photos. Hidden on a disposable camera I had kept tucked away for years were images of bruises, swollen lips, scratches across my arms. I developed them in secret, then scanned the prints. Looking at them again made me want to vomit, but I forced myself to keep going. Each image was a piece of the puzzle proof that no one could ignore. The recordings came after. For months, I had been using a tiny voice recorder I bought with spare change, hiding it in the pocket of my jeans. It caught Richard screaming, threatening, cursing. It caught Diane laughing, mocking me. We clipped the best segments, labeling them carefully. One file stood out. Richard shouting, "I'll break you before I let you leave this house." Another with Diane's cold voice. "She deserves it." Hearing them made my skin crawl, but it also made me stronger. Maya introduced me to Sarah Klein, a young lawyer working pro bono for a local women's rights group. Sarah listened quietly as we laid out the evidence, her eyes hardening with each new piece. When the final recording played, she leaned back and said, "He's not untouchable. This is enough to build a case if we're careful." Those words felt like light breaking through a locked cell. Together, we built a plan. I would keep pretending to be obedient while Sarah prepared the legal groundwork. Maya would serve as backup, storing duplicates of everything in multiple places: her apartment, the cloud, even a USB drive hidden in her car. We left nothing to chance. The question was timing. Richard had an upcoming celebration planned, a lavish dinner party to mark the closing of a major case. Dozens of colleagues, clients, and friends would be there. Sarah suggested it as the perfect stage. If you want justice, you'll get it in court. But if you want the truth to cut him the way he cut you, make it public. So we built the trap. The video compilation was brutal but necessary. Images of bruises flashed across the screen, intercut with audio of Richard's rages, Diane's mocking laughter. It was raw, undeniable, damning. Maya helped edit it into a seamless presentation that would play automatically when triggered. Sarah arranged with law enforcement to have officers on standby, ready to step in as soon as the evidence was revealed. Each night, I lay awake rehearsing what it would feel like. Fear tangled with adrenaline, but beneath it all was a steel resolve. I wasn't the scared little girl anymore. I wasn't even the obedient daughter with her head bowed. I was a woman sharpening her truth into a blade. The night before the party, I looked in the mirror at the faint scar still visible along my jawline. For years, I had hated it proof of my father's violence, but now I touched it gently and whispered, "Tomorrow, this scar will be his undoing." The night of the party, the house looked like something out of a glossy magazine spread. Chandeliers glowed, crystal glasses sparkled, and laughter echoed through the halls as Richard's colleagues filed in. Diane floated among them in her emerald dress, greeting guests with a smile so polished no one could guess the cruelty behind it. Richard stood at the center of the room, basking in admiration, his arm raised in greeting, his voice booming with authority. I walked down the stairs slowly, every eye briefly flicking toward me. My black dress was simple but deliberate, chosen to make me look poised, controlled, unbroken. Inside, my heart hammered so violently I thought it might burst, but my face was calm. Richard noticed me and smirked. "There's my daughter," he announced loudly, pulling me closer by the arm. Still at home, still under my roof, still obedient. The crowd chuckled. My stomach clenched, but I kept my head bowed. They didn't know what was coming. Dinner was served, glasses clinked, forks scraped against porcelain, and conversation hummed around us. I barely tasted the food. My hand brushed against the small remote hidden in my lap, the trigger for everything. Maya was stationed outside with her laptop synced to the projector Richard had insisted be set up for his speech. He had planned to show off slides of his latest legal triumphs. Instead, it would be something very different. Finally, Richard stood, glass of wine in hand, his voice commanding silence. "To victory, to family, to discipline," he declared. "This is what makes success possible." Applause rippled through the room. My fingers tightened around the remote. My father raised his glass higher. "And, of course, to my wife and daughter who know better than anyone the value of order." His eyes locked on me, daring me to contradict him. I pressed the button. The screen behind him flickered. At first, guests assumed it was part of his presentation. Then the first photo appeared, my face. Bruised lips split. A collective gasp swept the room. Another image followed, purple welts across my arms. Then came the audio. Richard's voice roared through the speakers. "I'll break you before I let you leave this house." Murmurs erupted, shocked faces turning toward him. Then Diane's laugh filled the air. "Now you'll learn to keep that gutter mouth shut." Richard spun toward the screen, his face draining of color. "Turn that off!" he bellowed, but no one moved. Maya had locked the system. The video rolled on more photos, more recordings, years of abuse laid bare in a ruthless sequence. The room fell into horrified silence, broken only by gasps and whispers. Guests who once admired him now recoiled. Colleagues stared in disbelief. Clients shifted uncomfortably, some rising from their chairs. Richard lunged towards me, fury blazing in his eyes, but before he could reach me, the front doors swung open. Uniformed officers stepped inside, their voices calm but firm. "Richard Carter, you're under arrest for domestic assault and battery." The entire room froze. For once, my father had no words. As the officers cuffed him, the mighty lawyer, the man everyone feared, looked small. Diane stood pale and trembling, her hands shaking as she clutched her wine glass. And me. For the first time in my life, I lifted my head high, unafraid of his shadow. The mask had shattered. The truth was no longer mine alone to carry. It was carved into the minds of everyone in that room. The moment the handcuffs clicked shut, the air in the room shifted. Gasps turned into murmurs, murmurs into silence, and silence into the weight of realization that the man they once respected had been unmasked. Richard tried to speak, tried to summon that booming courtroom voice that had swayed juries and silenced adversaries for decades, but his words came out fractured, strangled by panic. "This is a mistake, an overreaction," he stammered, his usual confidence crumbling in front of everyone. The lead officer cut him off coldly. "Save it for the judge. We've reviewed the evidence." He tilted his head toward the projector where the last frames of bruises and blood were still frozen. The image of my broken jaw stared back at him, undeniable, irrefutable. Diane rushed forward, her hands trembling as she reached for him. "Richard, please. They don't understand. We can fix this." Her voice wavered, desperate, but the officers stepped between them. She turned her gaze to me, then eyes wide with a mix of shock and fury, as if I were the one who had betrayed her. In her world, appearances mattered more than truth, and I had ripped the mask from her face in front of everyone who mattered. Whispers rippled through the guests' colleagues, whispering about lost cases, clients murmuring about severed contracts, neighbors staring in horror at the man they thought they knew. A woman clutched her husband's arm and said aloud, "All these years, he was a monster." Others began to pull out phones, recording snapping photos, the scandal already escaping the walls of that dining room into the wider world. The officers began to lead Richard toward the door, but he twisted his head to glare at me. For the first time, the power in his eyes was gone. What was left was rage and something almost like fear. "You'll regret this," he hissed, but the words rang hollow, stripped of authority. I stood, my jaw still aching, my body shaking with adrenaline, but my voice was steady. "No, Father, the only thing I regret is not ending it sooner." My words carried through the room like a verdict. Heads turned, and for once, every gaze on me wasn't pity or amusement. It was respect. As Richard was shoved into the waiting police car the night outside, lit with the flash of cameras from reporters who had been tipped off by Sarah, the lawyer who had helped me. Within hours, headlines blazed across news outlets, prominent attorney arrested for domestic abuse. The reputation Richard had spent decades building collapsed in a single night. Inside, guests slipped out quietly ashamed of their laughter of the years they had ignored the signs. Diane remained frozen by the fireplace, her wine glass still in her hand, eyes glazed. I walked past her without a word, but she whispered barely audible, "What have you done?" I didn't answer. She already knew. The truth was out. Justice wasn't a whisper in my journal anymore. It was a gavel slamming down for the world to hear. And though the battle ahead would be long, courtrooms' testimonies sentencing that night marked the end of their power over me. For once, it was my voice that echoed, not theirs. In the weeks that followed, the fallout spread like wildfire. Richard's name dominated every newspaper, every evening broadcast, every online feed. Respected attorney exposed as abuser. The headlines read, paired with the same bruised photographs that had once been my shame but now became his ruin. Law firms cut ties overnight. Clients abandoned him in droves. Judges who had once greeted him warmly now recused themselves in disgust. Within a month, the state bar suspended his license. Within 3, he was formally disbarred. The empire he had built on intimidation and reputation crumbled into dust. The trial was grueling. I sat in the courtroom, jaw healed but scar still visible as the recordings played. My father's voice thundered through the speakers, his threats undeniable, his cruelty laid bare. The jury flinched at every word. Diane was called to testify. She tried to feign ignorance, but the laughter on those tapes made her complicity clear. When the verdict was read, guilty on multiple counts of domestic assault and aggravated battery, Richard's face turned ashen. The judge's sentence was swift, 10 years in state prison. For the first time in my life, I exhaled without fear of his shadow. Diane's downfall came more quietly, but no less devastating. The friends she once charmed stopped calling. The charity boards she chaired quietly removed her name from their rosters. Neighbors crossed the street rather than meet her eyes. In public, she clung to the story that she had only played along to survive, but no one bought it. Not after hearing her laugh, sharp and cruel, echo through those speakers. In the end, she was left with the one thing she had always feared most: irrelevance. As for me, the aftermath was both freeing and overwhelming. Reporters requested interviews. Advocacy groups reached out offering support and asking me to speak at events. For years, I had been voiceless, but now people wanted to hear my story. At first, I was hesitant. Sharing so much felt like ripping open wounds again. But then, I remembered the silence of those dinner tables, the way no one spoke up when I needed them most. If my voice could break that silence for someone else, then it was worth it. Financially, I struggled. Richard's accounts were frozen and Diane cut me off completely. But Maya helped me find work, and Sarah connected me with organizations that offered resources for survivors. Piece by piece, I rebuilt. The apartment was small, the furniture secondhand, but it was mine. For the first time, I could arrange a bookshelf without worrying someone would throw it against the wall. There were nights when nightmares woke me, nights when I still heard his voice in the dark. Healing wasn't a straight path, but each morning I reminded myself he was behind bars and I was free. The scar along my jaw remained a reminder etched into my skin. I used to hide it with makeup, but now I let it show. When people asked, I told them. Not to relive the pain, but to show the strength it represented. Richard lost everything: his career, his standing, his freedom. Diane lost the world she had curated so carefully. And me, I found something they could never touch, my own life lived on my own terms. 1 year after the night my father was taken away in handcuffs, I sat at a small desk in my own apartment, the soft hum of the city drifting through the window. The space was modest peeling paint in the hallway, second-hand furniture, a mattress that sagged in the middle, but to me, it was a palace. Every object in that room had been chosen by me, placed by me, untouched by his fists or her laughter. It was the first place that ever truly felt like mine. Healing wasn't simple. There were nights I woke drenched in sweat, heart-pounding, convinced I heard his footsteps in the hallway. Sometimes the sound of glass breaking in a neighbor's unit sent me spiraling back into the kitchen where Diane's laugh echoed over my pain. But I had tools, now therapy sessions, that gave me language for what I had endured, a support group that reminded me I wasn't alone, and friends who refused to let me sink back into silence. Maya remained my anchor. On hard nights, she sat with me in silence, no need for words. On good days, she celebrated each small victory: my first article published in the local paper, my first lecture at a community college about resilience and survival, even the first plant I managed not to kill in my tiny apartment. She reminded me constantly, "You're building a life, Lydia, one brick at a time." Sarah, the lawyer who had guided me through the storm, became more than an advocate. She became a mentor, pushing me to use my writing not just as therapy, but as a weapon for change. "Your words put him in a cell," she told me once. "Now let them set others free." That sentence burned into me. I began to write openly about domestic abuse, about gaslighting, about the masks families wear. Each article I published felt like reclaiming another piece of myself. As months passed, I started to see the scar on my jaw differently. It wasn't just evidence of his violence anymore. It was proof that I had survived, that I had endured the worst and still stood. When strangers noticed it, I didn't shrink away. Instead, I said, "Yes, it's a scar, but it's also a story, and it's mine." I even received a letter from Diane. Her handwriting wavered across the page, apologies mixed with excuses, confessions laced with guilt. She wrote, "I failed you as a mother. I don't expect forgiveness, but I hope someday you'll understand that fear made me a coward." I read it once, twice, then folded it away in a drawer. Forgiveness wasn't something I could offer, not yet, maybe not ever. My healing didn't depend on her redemption. It depended on me. The day Richard's sentencing was finalized, I stood outside the courthouse and felt the sun warm my face. 10 years. A decade where he couldn't touch me, couldn't silence me, couldn't harm anyone else. For the first time, the future stretched before me, not as a threat, but as a promise. Now, when I tell my story, I always end with, "This pain leaves marks." Yes, but so does survival. My father's fists tried to break me. My mother's laughter tried to erase me, but they failed. Instead, they forged me into someone unafraid to speak, someone who knows the power of her own voice. If you're listening, if you've ever felt trapped in silence like I did, know this: you are not alone. You are stronger than the voices that try to crush you. And one day, like me, you will close the door on the past and step into a life that is fully, unapologetically yours.